Our gospel this morning is from Luke, the 17th chapter, beginning with verse 11 through 19. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And he saw them, and he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw, he was healed, and he turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up, go on your way. Your faith has made you well." The gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The congregation may be seated. Martin Luther was once asked to describe what is the true nature of worship. And he responded, "The 10th leper that turned around." You and I are in this season of Luke where we are starting to process all the way to Christ the King Sunday, all the way into Advent. And so Luke is trying to help us as much as he can understand a little bit more about faith. So we hear Luke's story yet again where Jesus is teaching disciples then and disciples now what faith is. Last week we talked about that faith is not just about believing. And today we talk that faith also involves seeing. I have my eye doctor on speed dial. And so I called my eye doctor early this week and I asked their assistants, say, "Do you have any stories for me about where seeing, being able to see, made all the difference in their lives, someone's life?" "Well," she said, "of course." She said, "You know Dr. Kivlin goes to all those third world countries?" "Yes, yes. And what he does is he collaborates with the local Lions Club. And the Lions Club collects people's old glasses that they don't use anymore. And then he, as the doctor, goes to these countries and he does eye exams. And then for some of these adults and children, he matches their prescription with their eyeglasses and suddenly they can see. And it's this beautiful, powerful story. But she said, it's not just kids in third world countries, it's also kids here in Wisconsin. And she said 9 times out of 10, when those children who they maybe thought had some learning disabilities, but turns out it was their eyesight, when they put those glasses on for the first time, she said they always notice the trees. No longer is it just this big blur, but they say, "Oh, look at the leaves on the trees." And isn't that rather fitting that here in Wisconsin, when it's the prettiest in the fall, these children wouldn't be able to see that if they hadn't had gotten new glasses. It makes all the difference. And she said, the attendant at the eye place, they said, "Do you have time for one more story?" Because you could hear she was starting to get kind of excited about sharing all these things. And I said, "Well, sure, go ahead." She said, there is a high school boy, and he plays football for the local high school team. And he wears glasses. And he has a pretty thick eyeglass prescription. And he came in because he said, "I probably should get contacts." And they were a little worried about finding just the right, because his prescription is so unique and so special, they weren't sure they would get the right contacts for him. And the staff asked him, "Young man, what did you do before this?" And he said, "I didn't wear anything. I really couldn't see." What a difference being able to see will make for him as a student athlete. In light of these stories, this is exactly what Jesus is trying to help us understand in relation to our faith today. As Christ followers, we realize that being able to see also shapes our faith even now. In our story that we heard, 10 lepers were healed. But one, however, as they obediently went to the priest, started to notice something, started to see something, started to take in to his heart what he was seeing. And he realized it was making all the difference. And because of what he saw, he then sees Jesus. He sees Jesus' power. He sees Jesus' reign. And because of what he saw, he gives thanks. He praises God with what kind of voice? Was it a soft voice? It was a loud voice. And because of what he sees, he doesn't keep going with where he was going. He instead turns around and he gives thanks to God and he praises him with this loud voice, and it made all the difference. That's what we're talking about in our lives, that faith is more than just about believing. It's sometimes also about seeing. And it changes our course as well when we see through the eyes of faith. But let me ask you some questions, maybe to help us bring it a little closer into our vision. When you look into the face of adversity, do you see danger or opportunity? And when you look at the face of human need, do you see burden or gift? When you look into the face of a stranger, do you see potential enemy or friend? And if we look at it a little closer, maybe a little bit more intimately, when we look at God, do we see judge or loving parent? And when we look in the mirror, do we see failure or do we see a beloved child? And when we look at our future, do we see fearful uncertainty or do we see a new horizon? There are no right answers to any of these questions. But how we answer depends on what we see. And how we answer dramatically shapes how we respond, how our outlook is. You and I, we are in the time of our stewardship learning. We had a beautiful mission message. And you know what's also helpful is that before we enter worship, what is it that we see on the screen? Well, perhaps seeing is key to our stewardship. Now, stewardship is not about giving money. That's one aspect. But stewardship really doesn't happen first by our giving. No. Stewardship happens first by what we see, all that we have been given. We can't help but share after we realize all that God has first given us. And what about the question of worship? Maybe seeing is really the key to our worship. I know that some people will say, well, worship is about praising God and hearing the scriptures and singing the songs. And yes, I would agree with you, but it's also so much more. It's about gathering with one another, friends, neighbors, people we don't know, young people, and hearing the stories and sharing with one another and singing praises. Because really it's intended to see God's work in the world where we are. That's why I'm so proud of this congregation embracing this God's work, our hands idea of sharing. It's not what we do, but worship is what God does through us. So perhaps seeing is really part of the Christian life. Before you and I are called to believe, before we are called to serve and welcome and equip, before we are called to say the creeds of faith, we are simply invited by Jesus to come and see. Just come and see. And because of what we see, we invite others. So let me recap the Bible story that we've heard this morning. 10 men were stuck. They lived in between regions. They lived, if you will, in no man's land. They were kept at arm's length as far as they could because they were labeled unclean. And by the end of the story, all 10 are made well. But one has something different. He has seen Jesus. He recognized his blessing. He rejoiced in that blessing, and it changed his course of action and behavior. Because that 10th leper sees what has happened, he's not just healed. No. He's made whole. He is restored. He is brought back into a relationship not only with God, but with all of humanity. Remember, this person was kept at arm's length for so many years. And one thing that I love about the Greek is that when, at the end of the story, it says that the man was saved. Being made whole, being restored, brought into a right relationship is summed up in one word: saved. So my friends, I ask you, what is our true stewardship? What is true worship? What is truly the Christian life? Maybe Martin Luther was right when he said, it's the 10th leper that turned back. Because seeing really is part of our faith and our journey forward. Amen.